was in 3rd grade, I had a teacher named Mrs. Todd. She was this short, kind of odd lady, but she was always incredibly nice to me. She'd call on me first to do the fun activities, and she'd constantly compliment my work. I remember feeling like she was one of my favorite people in the world. I even told my mom about her, saying how much I loved having Mrs. Todd as my teacher. One day, though, something weird happened. I got to class and sat down, and like usual, I opened my desk to put my stuff in it. But there, in the pull-out drawer, was a Victoria's Secret magazine. I was totally shocked. This was 3rd grade, and I barely knew what that was, but I knew it felt like something I shouldn't have. My first thought was that I'd somehow get in trouble, and I remember just staring at it, unsure of what to do. The kid who sat next to me, I think his name was Ryan, noticed my reaction. He leaned over and looked inside my desk, and he started laughing. He was like, "Dude, why do you have that in your desk?" I tried to explain that I had no idea how I got there, but before I could even finish, Mrs. Todd appeared beside us. She looked down at the magazine, then back at me with this intense look. "What have you got there?" she asked. Her voice was calm, almost too calm, like she already knew what she was going to say next. I told her, still confused, that the magazine was just sitting at my desk when I arrived. I honestly thought she believed me, especially since she was always so nice. But instead, she turned her attention to Ryan and said, "Ryan, did you put this in his desk?" Ryan looked as surprised as I was. "No, I didn't," he stammered, looking back and forth between me and Mrs. Todd. But Mrs. Todd kept insisting, almost chanting it. It was him, wasn't it? He put it there, right? She kept repeating it, like she wanted me to agree with her. I remember feeling so confused and nervous. I didn't want to accuse Ryan, but Mrs. Todd was relentless. She kept at it until I finally mumbled, "I guess he could have put it there." She seemed satisfied with that answer, like she'd gotten exactly what she wanted. A few days later, Mrs. Todd pulled me aside after class. She had this odd smile, almost like she was trying to act extra friendly. She told me she was really proud of how well I was doing and mentioned a special reward she was planning. She said if I kept up the good work, she would take me on a special field trip. She explained that it would just be her and me, and we'd go down to the Gulf of Mexico for the weekend. She described it like this amazing adventure, and at the time I was thrilled. I mean, a weekend trip just for me. It sounded like the coolest thing ever. I remember I ran home that day, thinking about the trip, almost ready to tell my mom about it. But something felt off, even then. I did not bring it up, and in hindsight, I think part of me knew it wasn't something my parents would have been okay with. But then, just as quickly as she had mentioned the trip, things changed. Out of nowhere, Mrs. Todd was replaced by another teacher. I did not see her again, and I remember feeling heartbroken. The new teacher wasn't as friendly, and I spent the rest of the year wishing Mrs. Todd would come back. It wasn't until years later, when I looked back on all these little moments, that it hit me. Mrs. Todd's behavior was beyond strange. The magazine, the field trip invitation, the way she insisted that Ryan had set me up, it all came together in this unsettling way. She had manipulated me, somehow testing me, pushing me to go along with things that didn't feel right. Looking back, I can't believe how naive I was. It's terrifying to think about what might have happened if she hadn't suddenly disappeared from the school. When I was a kid, we lived in a small, rundown apartment complex in a rough part of town. My mom had this soft spot for people who seemed down on their luck. That's probably why she took an instant liking to our downstairs neighbor, Karen. Karen was older, probably in her late 40s, with these tired, hollow eyes that lit up only briefly when she smiled. She had recently gone through a rough breakup, and most days, she just looked like she was carrying the weight of something too heavy to talk about. Mom would invite her up for coffee or tea, and they sit at our tiny kitchen table, talking for hours. I never paid too much attention, just knew she was there. Her laugh kind of thin and strained, like she was forcing herself to seem okay. Then, a few weeks went by without seeing her. It wasn't super unusual. She kept to herself most of the time. But my mom started to worry, especially since Karen had been so regular about coming up for a chat. One evening, she decided we should go downstairs to check on her. I remember every detail of that walk. The hallway smelled musty, like it always did, but colder. The dim light bulbs flickered, casting these weird shadows along the cracked walls. When we got to her door, my mom knocked a couple of times, then tried calling her name. No answer. My mom glanced at me, then knocked again, harder this time. The door shifted under her hand and slowly creaked open. I know it sounds cliche, but it was like it had been waiting to be opened. The air that seeped out hit us instantly, a stench so thick and sour it made my stomach flip. We stepped inside. The living room was dark, the blinds drawn tight. A few dishes were piled up in the sink, untouched for who knows how long. There was a weird silence hanging in the air, like the whole place was holding its breath. Mom called out to her again. Her voice was shaky. No answer. She took a deep breath and nodded to herself and made her way to the bathroom. I trailed behind, feeling my chest tighten. The bathroom door was halfway open. I remember seeing Karen's reflection in the mirror first. A shock of matted hair, her pale face barely visible. Then I saw her. She was in the bathtub, slumped over, her arms dangling over the side, streaked with dried blood. The water had turned this horrible, rusty color. The smell was unbearable, sharp and rotten, like nothing I'd ever experienced. My mom gasped, covering her mouth, but she did not look away. After what felt like forever, she took my hand and led me out of there. We didn't say a word all the way back upstairs. When we got inside, she finally turned to me, her face pale and her eyes kind of empty. "Don't worry, Mark," she said, trying to force a smile. She was our friend, so she won't haunt us. I didn't say anything. I just nodded, trying to block out the image of Karen in that tub. For a long time after that, every time I walked by her door, I felt like someone was watching me. And every once in a while, when the hall got real quiet, I thought I could hear the creak of her door opening all over again. It was a typical Thursday in mid-July, warm enough that the sun lingered even at 6 p.m. I just clocked out from work and was taking my usual route through the local park to get home. The park's nothing special, one of those small, inner-city places with some scraggly trees, a swing set, and patchy grass, mostly frequented by people walking their dogs or letting their kids blow off steam. At night, it could be a little dodgy, but during the day, it felt perfectly safe. The shortcut I used every day cut through a small gate about halfway down the park's path. It saved me a couple of minutes, and while I could have gone around, I never thought twice about it. That day, though, I noticed two guys around my age standing directly in front of the gate. They looked young, early 20s maybe, both Asian, dressed casually in jeans and t-shirts. My first thought was that they were just chatting, maybe waiting for someone, but something about their body language made me uneasy. They were positioned awkwardly close to each other, blocking the gate entirely. A strange feeling settled in my stomach, a kind of primal instinct telling me to avoid them. But then my rational mind kicked in, dismissing it as paranoia. It was daylight after all, with people around, and I figured I could just ask them to move. As I got closer, one of the guys stepped back, out of my line of sight, disappearing into the bushes that grew next to the path. The other guy suddenly looked up at me and called out, "Hey, you got the time?" His tone was casual, almost friendly, but forced. Immediately, something about the question felt wrong. Why ask me, with a phone in his pocket and a giant clock at the entrance of the park? Instinct screamed at me, but I ignored it and kept walking, planning to brush him off and go around if he did not move. As I was about to answer, I noticed the second guy crouching low behind the bushes, eyes trained on me. My heart rate spiked, and that's when I saw the car. It was an older model sedan, parked just a few feet from the gate, positioned strangely as if it was ready for a quick getaway. Two more guys crouched beside the car, barely visible, but I could see enough to know they weren't just hanging out. My brain pieced it together in a split second. These guys were planning something that involved me walking through that gate. Without pausing to think, I did a turnaround and headed back up the path in the opposite direction, forcing myself to keep my pace steady. My mind was racing, pulse pounding, but I told myself not to run. I did not want to trigger them into following me. I did not look back. I just kept walking, my focus fixed on the closest exit at the far end of the park. And then I heard that same voice again, calling after me, louder and sharper this time. "Hey, you, what's the time?" I could hear the irritation in his tone, as if I'd broken some kind of unspoken agreement by not playing along. I ignored him, my steps quickening, each one feeling heavier as I distanced myself from them. The silence that followed felt almost worse than shouting. I couldn't tell if they were following, if they'd gotten back into the car, if they were waiting for me somewhere else in the park. My head spun with worst-case scenarios, and every instinct screamed at me to keep moving, not to let my guard down. By the time I reached my apartment building, my hands were shaking so badly that I fumbled the keys, dropping them twice before finally managing to get the door open. The whole way upstairs, I kept looking over my shoulder, fully expecting to see one of them standing at the bottom, watching me. Once inside, I bolted every lock and finally allowed myself to exhale. My phone buzzed. It was a friend asking me to come out for drinks. I ignored it, sinking onto my couch, my mind racing with what could have happened if I'd taken a few more steps towards that gate. My cousin and his family had lived in their house for about 5 years, never suspecting anything out of the ordinary. The place wasn't fancy, but it was a solid home, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. My cousin and his wife mostly kept to themselves. They had a 1-year-old son who had just started daycare, so mornings were often a flurry of activity. One day, my cousin's wife was doing her usual morning routine. She dropped the baby off at daycare, but halfway to work, she realized she'd left her phone at home. She swung back to grab it, figuring she'd be in and out in a minute. But when she unlocked the door and stepped inside, something was wrong. She walked down the hallway and nearly ran straight into the attic ladder, hanging down from the ceiling. That ladder was always shut. They never used the attic. My cousin had checked it once after they moved in, saw that it was filled with loose insulation, and decided to leave it alone. There was nothing they needed up there, and besides, the dust and fiberglass made it a hassle to deal with. She stood there for a moment, staring up at the open attic, her heart starting to pound. My cousin had left hours earlier for work, and she knew he hadn't been up there. Something in her gut told her that this wasn't a mistake or a random occurrence. Instead of going further inside, she backed out quietly, went back to her car, and drove around the corner. From there, she called the police. She told them what she found, about the attic ladder being down, and they took her seriously. Within minutes, 2 officers were there, walking through the house with her. When they reached the attic, one of the officers climbed up, flashlight in hand. He was up there for what felt like forever, poking around before he called down for his partner to join him. My cousin's wife stood at the bottom, trying to keep calm, but her mind was racing. Eventually, the officers came down, their expressions grave. They led her to the living room and told her what they'd found. A small transmitter wired to multiple cameras. There were cameras in the bathroom light fixture, the ceiling fan over their bed, even a tiny one drilled into the wall of the nursery. They had been live feeding videos somewhere nearby. After checking records, the police uncovered that their neighbor, who lived just a few houses away, had a spare key given to him by the previous owners. It turned out he'd been letting himself in and out for years, just waiting for the right moment to install the equipment. Apparently, he'd been keeping tabs on their schedule, knowing when the house was empty. That day, he must have been in the attic, updating or adjusting something, but forgot something back at his place, leaving the attic ladder down. When they questioned him, he confessed to everything. He'd been watching them in their most private moments, in their bedroom, even the nursery, watching their son sleep. My cousin and his wife moved out immediately. They never set foot in that house again, and I don't blame them. It's the kind of thing that makes you question every creak in the floor, every misplaced item, every feeling you've ever had about someone watching you. And the worst part, he was right there, just a few doors down, pretending to be a friendly neighbor all along. When I was about 16, my parents left me alone for the weekend. I decided to sleep in their room since they had a TV, and, well, my room felt too quiet. Everything was fine until around 2 a.m. I was half awake, drifting in and out, when I got this intense, prickling feeling, like someone was watching me. I opened my eyes, still a bit dazed, and looked toward the hallway. The TV's glow barely stretched that far, but I could make out the silhouette of something or someone standing in the doorway. It wasn't like a person in the shadows. It was a solid, human-shaped black mass, completely featureless. But here's the thing that really scared me. I could see it clearly despite the darkness. It was as if it was absorbing the light, like it was meant to be there. My heart started pounding. I felt frozen. My mind started racing, but my body locked in place. I did not want to move or even blink, afraid it might come closer if I did. We just stared at each other for what felt like forever, though it was probably 5 seconds or maybe less. Then, just as suddenly, it turned. The figure slowly walked down the hall, disappearing into the darkness. That should have been enough, but it got worse. As soon as it vanished, I heard a loud, echoing crash from somewhere down the hallway. It was loud enough to shake me out of my shock, and I finally managed to sit up, my entire body on edge. The rational part of me wanted to get up and check what had happened, but every instinct I had told me to stay put. I grabbed the remote and flipped the channel to Disney, trying to drown out my fear with something familiar. I stayed there, wide awake, forcing myself to watch cartoons until the sun started to rise. The next morning, I finally worked up the nerve to check the hallway. As soon as I stepped out of the bedroom, I saw it. A mirror that had been hanging in the hallway had fallen to the ground and shattered into pieces. It was a heavy, framed mirror, the kind you'd expect to be bolted securely. I knew that mirror had been there for years, undisturbed. When my parents came back, I told them everything. I could see the skepticism in their faces, like they thought it was just some weird nightmare I'd concocted. My mom shrugged off the broken mirror, saying it must have been a loose nail or something, but that explanation never sat right with me. The mirror didn't just fall, it felt wrong, like something had pushed it. And to this day, I can still picture the shadow figure, clear as day, standing in the doorway. I don't know what it was, and I had never seen anything like it since, but I know I did not imagine it. So a little backstory. Last weekend, my best friend Kayla, her boyfriend James, and I went camping out at Sumner National Forest. It wasn't the best night for it. Rain had been coming down all day, and by the time we got there, the place was deserted. We thought we'd have the whole forest to ourselves, which sounded kind of exciting, until it started getting creepy. It was too wet to pitch a tent, so we decided to sleep in James's SUV. We set up some blankets and pillows in the back, and I pulled out my copy of Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark to pass the time. The rain was still tapping on the roof, sounding almost like footsteps if you let your imagination get the best of you. and as it got darker, I think we all started feeling a little more on edge. Around midnight, we finally called it a night. Kayla was curled up in the back, and I was on one of the seats, drifting off with that steady rain as white noise. That's when I noticed it. A sound just faint enough to make you question if it's really there. Footsteps, or at least something that sounded like it, slowly crunching on the wet ground outside. And at first, I tried to brush it off as my mind playing tricks, but it got louder. It wasn't random like the rain. It was a steady, purposeful sound, getting closer. "Did you guys hear that?" I whispered. Kayla sat up, looking at the fogged-up windows, and I could see that she was nervous, and James, who was usually the one to brush everything off, was tense too. He turned on the headlights, and that's when I saw it. A shadow moving between the trees on the right side of the car. I couldn't make out much, but there was definitely something, or someone, out there. James, being the manly guy he is, grabbed a flashlight and opened the door before we could stop him. Kayla and I were pleading with him to stay inside, but he just told us to lock the doors and that he'd be right back. He made it about 20 yards into the trees, shining his light around, and we were straining to keep him in sight through the rain-blurred windows. Suddenly, he turned and came sprinting back, his face pale and twisted with terror. He slammed into the SUV and shouted, "Go, go, go." I did not need to be told twice. I scrambled over the seats to get the driver's side and jammed the keys into the ignition. As I hit the gas, something burst out of the tree line, just close enough for us to catch a glimpse. It looked like a man, but he was covered in filthy, torn-up clothes, with matted hair hanging over his face. His features were wrong, like his skin was stretched too tight, his mouth twisted in this eerie, unnatural grin. James was breathing hard, barely able to get his words out. "When I shined the flashlight at him," he said, "he just looked up and started running at me. We drove out of there as fast as we could, not stopping until we hit a Piggly Wiggly parking lot about half an hour away. None of us said a word for a long time, and we ended up sleeping in that parking lot until sunrise. I don't know who that guy was, but I don't think any of us will be camping out there anytime soon." About 10 years ago, my mom got this strange envelope in the mail. I remember every detail vividly because it's burned into my memory. She came into the kitchen, her face drained of color, holding a white envelope addressed to her. There was no return address, no stamp, just Florida, scrawled in blue ink where the sender's information would usually be. We live in Ohio, over 1,000 miles away, and at the time, I couldn't think of a single person we knew from Florida. Mom sat down and carefully opened it. Inside was a single baby picture. Her as a baby, wrapped up in a pink blanket, looking up with those wide, innocent eyes. I recognized the photo instantly, because we'd seen it before in an old box in the basement. Mom told me she kept that box untouched for over 20 years. There was absolutely no reason that the photo should have left our basement, let alone traveled to Florida. And taped to the back of the picture was a small note, written in the same blue ink as the address on the envelope. It simply read, "I think you sent this by mistake." We both sat in silence, staring at the note, as a chill crept up my spine. I watched my mom flip the picture over a few times, maybe hoping for some other clue. But that was it. Just her baby photo and a single line of text. And I asked her if she could have accidentally sent it to someone, or posted it online, or something. But she shook her head, her hands trembling slightly. That box of old photos, where this specific baby picture was stored, was in the far corner of our basement, under a bunch of dusty, untouched holiday decorations. No one had gone near it in years. We went down to the basement together and pulled the box out. Sure enough, there was a small, empty space where the picture had been. The rest of the pictures were still there. Old family portraits, school photos, all in the exact same spot they'd been left in. I remember asking, what if someone broke in and took it? But that didn't make sense either. Nothing else in the house was disturbed, and who would break into a random house, take one baby photo, and somehow send it back to us from Florida? It seemed impossible. The days that followed were tense. My mom kept the photo in her room, tucked away, and I could tell it was always on her mind. Every time the mail came, she paused, almost dreading another envelope. But nothing else came. No follow-up, no explanation. Just this one baby picture that somehow made its way over 1,000 miles. Eventually, we tried to brush it off, but to this day, we still have no answers. I can't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, was watching us, knew more than they should. Sometimes I wonder if they were just playing with us, seeing if we notice. And honestly, I'll never stop wondering, how did that picture get there? A few years ago, my husband worked night shifts, usually getting home around 6 a.m. He worked about 45 minutes away, so I was used to having the nights to myself with our 2 kids. One night, I let the kids watch a movie in my bed on the laptop. It was already late, around 10 p.m., and I figured they'd fall asleep during the movie. I locked up the house, we got ready for bed, and we started watching the movie. About 40 minutes in, I heard footsteps in the dining room. My bedroom is directly off the dining room, and the hardwood floors made every step seem obvious. I leave the dining room light on for my husband when he's working, so my bedroom door was almost closed, with just a crack to block the light. At first I did not think too much of it. My husband must have gotten home early, I thought. But after a few minutes of hearing someone walk back and forth across the dining room, I started to wonder why he hadn't come into the bedroom. I paused the movie, told the kids to stay in bed, and went to check. As soon as I opened the door, the footsteps stopped. The dining room was empty. I stepped out and scanned the area, but there was no one there. My stomach tightened as I realized how quiet the house had suddenly become. I checked the front door. It was locked, just as I left it. I walked through the rest of the house, my heart pounding, checking every window, closet, and corner. Nothing. Everything was locked and untouched. Then I heard a quiet meow, and I laughed at myself. It had to be the cat. I'd been scaring myself over nothing. I headed to the kitchen to feed him, but when I got there, I froze. The cat was sitting on the back porch, staring at me through the glass door. The door was locked. That's when my phone rang. It was my husband. Relief washed over me for a split second, but his first words brought it all back. "Hey, just wanted to let you know to double-check the locks tonight. Someone broke into a house a couple of streets over earlier today." My knees went weak. I could barely get the words out. "Are you sure you didn't come home at all?" "No, I'm still at work. I'll be done around 6. And I couldn't stop myself from crying out at that point. I told him everything, from the footsteps to the locked door and the cat. He stayed on the phone with me as I walked through the house again, checking every lock, every possible hiding spot. Nothing was out of place, and no one was there. For the rest of the night, I did not sleep. I sat in the bedroom with the kids, clutching a kitchen knife and waiting for morning. My husband came home at his usual time, and we did not find anything missing. But to this day, I can't explain what happened. I don't know if it was someone who got scared off or something else entirely, but I know what I heard, and I'll never forget the way those footsteps stopped the moment I opened the door. This still creeps me out, and I honestly haven't told many people about it. It happened when I was a kid, and I feel like it explains why I've always been uneasy about using the phone. Growing up, I had almost no supervision. My mom worked long day shifts, and my dad worked night shifts. During the day, he was supposed to be watching me, but he usually slept. That meant I had free rein until my mom came home. Most days, I'd watch TV or mess around with my toys until I got bored, which did not take long. When that happened, I'd grab the home phone and retreat to my room. I thought it was hilarious to press random numbers and see who I could get on the other end. Most of the time it was a dead line, or people would just hang up when they heard a kid's voice. A few would yell at me or warn me not to call strangers, but I didn't care. One time, though, I hit a real number, and the person who picked up still sends chills down my spine. I remember pressing a bunch of buttons, and after a couple of rings, a man answered. His voice was calm, but kind of gravely. "Hello," he said. I asked who he was, my usual icebreaker. There was a pause, and then he said, "I'm Santa." Being a gullible little kid, I was immediately thrilled. "Santa, really?" I said, and chuckled. "Yep, it's me," he said. I spent the next 10 or 15 minutes peppering him with every question I could think of. I asked about the North Pole, reindeer, elves, you name it. He played along, answering everything like he was really Santa Claus. For a while, it was actually kind of fun. Then things got weird. At some point, Santa told me that one of his elves had misplaced my address. He said he wouldn't be able to deliver presents unless I told him where I lived. My stomach dropped. I did not know my address. I was too young to remember something like that. But I wanted my presents, so I started to panic. I remember him staying calm, his voice soft, as he encouraged me to think hard and try to remember it. I was practically in tears, mumbling half-formed guesses. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I ran into my parents' bedroom yelling, "Santa needs our address." My dad woke up, groggy and furious. He grabbed the phone from my hands and barked, "Who the hell is this?" I remember standing there, sniffling while my dad pressed the phone to his ear, and after a few seconds, his face hardened. Without saying a word, he hung up and slammed the phone down on the nightstand. He looked at me, his expression a mix of anger and something else, maybe fear, and said, "You're never touching that phone again." I never found out what that man said to my dad, but the home phone got moved to the living room after that, and I wasn't allowed to go anywhere near it. Looking back, I shudder to think who that man really was, and what could have happened if I did know my address. The fact that he sounded so normal, so convincing, is what unsettles me the most. It makes you realize that not every creepy stranger sounds creepy right away. I never believed in ghosts or hauntings, but the week that my house turned into a nightmare changed everything. It started off small, so small that I tried to brush it off. That first night, I woke up to a faint banging noise. It wasn't loud, just a repetitive thud that I thought might have been the old pipes or maybe the house settling. I was too tired to care until I heard my son screaming from his room. I rushed in and found him sitting upright in his bed, his face streaked with tears. "Mommy, please make the drawers stop," he cried. "They keep opening and closing by themselves." My stomach dropped. I turned to look at his dresser and watched in disbelief as the drawers slid open and shut, one after another. Slow, deliberate. There was no explanation. I grabbed my son, bolted back to my room, and locked the door. The next night was worse. My newborn daughter woke me up for a feeding, and I stumbled into the kitchen to warm her bottle. As I bent over the counter, the chandelier above me exploded. Not just one bulb, all of them. Shards of glass rained down on me, cutting my hands and arms. I froze, clutching the counter, too stunned to even cry out. It felt targeted, like something wanted me to know that I wasn't safe. The third night, my oldest son was playing with a red balloon that he gotten earlier that day. I was sitting on the couch, half watching him, when the balloon suddenly ripped itself out of his hand. I thought it must have popped, but it didn't. It floated, slowly, methodically. I watched, unable to move as the balloon glided through the living room, down into the basement, and then back up the stairs. The string moved like someone invisible was holding it. It drifted all the way up to the attic. my son clung to me the rest of the night, too scared to let go. I stayed up shaking, waiting for something else to happen. At 3 a.m. the next night, my phone rang. It was my neighbor. Her voice was shaky and panicked. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I called the police. There are people surrounding your house." And I froze. I peeked out the window, but saw nothing. No people, no shadows, nothing but my empty yard. When the cops arrived, they searched the entire property and found no sign of anyone. My neighbor swore she'd seen over a dozen figures standing in a circle around my house, just staring at it. The following night, another neighbor pounded on my front door, yelling for me to answer. When I opened it, he was furious. "Why is that woman in your attic staring at me?" My blood ran cold. "What woman?" I asked. "The one with the long, dark hair," he said. "She's been staring out the attic window at me for hours." The problem was, there was no flooring in the attic near the window. No one could even stand there. But the final night was what broke me. I had to put my newborn down for a nap on my bed. She was swaddling tightly, lying in her side sleeper pillow with cushions all around her. There was no way she could even move on her own. I stepped into the shower, and when I came back, my heart stopped. She wasn't in the side sleeper anymore. She was on the very edge of the bed, just inches from falling. The cushions were still in place, untouched, as if something had lifted her up and over them. I screamed, not in fear, but in rage. "That's it. You're done. You do not touch my kids, ever." I shouted at whatever was in the house. "You are not welcome here, and I've got Jesus Christ on my side." The next morning, I had the house blessed. Everything stopped after that, but I couldn't stay there. I moved out within the month. Since then, 2 families have bought the house. Both moved out after a few months, and now it sits vacant. People in the neighborhood say something isn't right with it, that it feels off. I don't know what's in that house, but whatever it is, it can stay there. I'll never step foot in that place again. Hey, what's up guys? It's Spooky. If you've made it this far, congratulations, you survived. If you did not know, I have an Instagram. Follow me on there so we can connect. And I also have a Patreon. On there you'll have direct access to me and can see the upcoming videos, polls, and soon-to-be exclusive stories only shared on there. If that's something that interests you, please consider joining. That's all I have for you guys tonight. Stay spooky and I'll see you in the next video.